Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here in the direction of the Zaporizhzhia front, where the Russians have managed to push the Ukrainians beyond the Surovikin line and have managed to regain control over this one field here to the west of Verbove. And with this, the final battles are taking place for the Russians to regain full control over the Surovikin line, which would put a setback in the Ukrainian advances throughout the summer offensive, and it will return the fighting to the Robotyne direction, as the Ukrainians would have a difficult time developing any situation here in the east without restarting offensive operations. Therefore, the Russians will likely look to focus their efforts on Robotyne and push the Ukrainians back from the Robotyne salient. Moving on north in the direction of Polyapole, there has been a restart of Russian offensive operations in this section of the front line, where the Russians are storming the Dacha area here to the north of Marfopil. And with this, we see that the Russians are advancing into a largely empty area. There are a few Ukrainian positions within it, but very few. The main force that they have to deal with is Ukrainian artillery hitting their positions as they try to advance and develop the situation towards Polyapole, which would indicate a new Russian offensive operation in this section of the front line. And this brings me to the fact that the Russians have not really yet started their spring offensive. What we're seeing is that they are still developing the situations one by one. The Russians will likely start offensive operations everywhere on the front line, and this will not be the big offensive. This will just be what the Ukrainians called probing attacks and initial offensive operations to develop the situation and form the battlefield for what comes next. And what comes next is what we can hear from this US senator talking about the situation.
Made it so clear how vital this was to the United States. This was so important. And that we couldn't afford to wait a month or 2 months or 3 months because we would, in all likelihood, lose the war. NATO would be fractured at best. Allies would turn away from the United States.
He's talking about the aid that Congress has yet to approve to Ukraine, and he's saying that without this aid, or just waiting to send the aid a couple of months, which they have been so far, could end up making Ukraine lose the war just due to the delay, much less if it doesn't get there at all. At the same time, insider sources from the Ukrainian office of the president claims that Russia is preparing for a large, massive offensive. According to the insider sources, the Ukrainian allies have told Ukraine that Russia plans on an operation where they will lead an offensive towards Kiev through Chernihiv, and this will just be a distraction where the main push would be going through to Odessa in the south. According to these insider sources, the Ukrainians responded by preparing and building up the defenses around Kiev and securing Kiev so that if the Russians launch an offensive, they'll be able to secure Kiev and relocate some soldiers to the south to deal with Odessa. I'll cover more about this potential offensive operation, which is very similar to my own video, Operation Trident Siege. However, we'll have to get that back into that later. For now, we go on to the Avdiivka section of the front line, where the Russians are attacking in 3 separate directions. First off, in the direction of Tonenke, the Russians have advanced and gained a small foothold within the village itself, and fighting is taking place within the center of it. And with this, we see that there are some developments here in the village of Tonenke. It is being clarified that the Russians are storming through the village, while the Ukrainians are defending the village, withdrawing 50 meters at a time. As we can see, this is about 50 to 100 meters. Like Zelensky said, great withdrawal to save the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. As for the northern parts, we see here the direction of Orelivka. The Russians started out by reaching the outskirts of the village. Then additional reports came in that they've gotten a foothold. And now we have gotten visual confirmation that the Russians have actually managed to capture the school here in Orelivka. And with this, the Russians have reached the center of Orelivka. Fighting likely also takes place in the northern parts. And with this, it is only a matter of time before the Russians push straight to the end of Orelivka, to the reservoir here to the west of the village, and moving northwards towards the northern parts of the village. And with these developments, we see that the Russians are getting closer and closer to capturing the villages of Tonenke and Orelivka. As for the third direction towards Berdishi, it is reported that the Russians have actually reached the Abrams tank that they have destroyed. If these reports are true and the Ukrainians were unable to retrieve it prior to the Russian offensive operations, the Russians will likely capture that, similar to how they have captured Leopard and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and tanks. And with this, we see that the Russians are getting their hands on more NATO equipment from the fighting taking place. The Russians are likely looking to capture Berdishi to avoid going to fight an uphill battle by fighting in the areas where the elevation is similar. They're also likely planning to go in a northern direction through the railways to Novobakhmutivka and Ocheretune. Ocheretune itself is located on a high ground that oversees this whole area and a necessary village for the Russians if they want to go further westwards and avoid the majority of the Ukrainian fortifications. We can see here that to the north of Berdishi, the Ukrainians have several layers of fortifications to the west of Novokalinove, but the majority of them are pointed in a eastern direction where they are meant to deal with a Russian attack coming from the east. Instead, the Russians are coming from the south, where the fortifications are more vulnerable considering that they're facing off against the eastern direction. And with that, the Russians are trying to attack from the best possible direction. However, we also see that here to the south of Ocheretune, there are several layers of trenches in its southern direction above the villages Novobakhmutivka and Solovyove. So with this, it is likely that the Russians are going to be fighting an uphill battle against Ukrainian fortifications if they are to gain control of Ocheretune. And that is located in the center of the next line of defense, which is situated around, depending from the east here, to the east of Ocheretune and to the south of the village. So with this, we see that it is likely that the Russians will focus on the southern parts before going in a northern direction to deal with that. Instead of going around and fighting through the fortifications, they would likely look to go around them by going through the railways and fighting from a northern direction, while combining that with an attack to the south to create a pincer maneuver through the roads here to the west of Avdiivka. That is it for the Avdiivka front. We then move on to the Bakhmut section of the front line, where here we do not have any concrete reports of advancements by the Russians. However, it is reported that there has been significant developments in this section of the front line. Some Ukrainian channels wrote in a panic that the village had fallen. However, it is reported that the majority of the fighting still takes place within the village. From the direction of Ivanivsky, we see this footage here, which shows some explosions taking place within the village. As fighting continues, heavy street fighting is taking place within the village, and as such we see that the Russians are dealing with the Ukrainians by heavily bombarding their positions and then storming their positions in the rubble. If you're wondering why these massive explosions take place here in the direction of Ivanivsky, so are the Ukrainian soldiers in Jazov Yar. In this video here, we see a Ukrainian soldier complaining about the sky, where you can see that there are these, which are from jet plane flying by. It is reported that the Russian jets are just flying over Jazov Yar, over Ivanivsky, and dropping bombs down there. And this is costing the Ukrainians heavy losses due to the effectiveness of jet planes overall. And with this information, we see that the Russians have largely dealt with the Ukrainian air defense in this section of the front line, and the Ukrainians are running low on their air defense material, likely protecting important areas instead of the whole front line. And with that, the Russians are able to deal heavy blows against the Ukrainian fortifications in the Bakhmut section of the front line, also reportedly at the Avdiivka section of the front line, allowing the Russians to advance with lesser casualties and more effectiveness. Finally, moving north in the direction of Tabaivka, here to the northwest of Svetove, there's further confirmation of the Russian presence here with this geolocated footage, confirming their presence in this section of the front line. This footage came very delayed, as this has happened a long time ago at the start or the end of January, really. And with this, we see that the confirmations of the fighting here by Tabaivka have been confirmed. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.